Greetings and salutations, Dota fans, and welcome into my very first mailbag. Oh, aren't you proud to be sharing this very special moment with me? Yeah, I don't get a ton of mail yet, but I get a bit. I get enough that I think I can justify doing this once a week, so thank you very much for being here, and how about we just jump right to it? Question number 1 from Snuff Tuff via email says, "Hey AC, I love the professionalism you bring to your cast." Well, thank you, Snuff Tuff. And you can definitely tell you worked in broadcasting in the past. Is the broadcasting voice something anyone can learn, or is it just something you're born with? In all honesty, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, there are some things you have limited control over or no control over at all. Your voice is what it is. I mean, there's no way around that. Some of us are nasally. Some of us have a much deeper timbre than most other people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on and on. Talk about accents, and accents is something you can kind of train out of yourself, and if you want to have any kind of a broadcasting sound, you usually have to limit it at least a little bit. You can detect a little bit of my accent. I mean, I grew up in southern West Virginia, so there are some things I'm never going to be able to get rid of, and I'm okay with that. It's who I am, and it's what I do. But a lot of it is tempered out. And if you go through and actually listen to some of my past broadcasts, you can detect it a little bit more. It's a little bit more thick when I start to get more tired or whenever I'm really excited and I don't have time to temper my speaking voice much. But, I mean, those are the things you have limited or no control over. However, sounding professional, learning to enunciate, having confidence in yourself that you can speak on the fly and about things that are happening in front of you, all of that can be trained in. I mean, I did go through quite a bit of training whenever I worked in radio in the past, and it helped me learn to do what I do now. And again, the judgments that others make so far as my professionalism, my sound, some people like it, some don't. So I always want to remain humble in that regard. Right now, I'm just really glad that people in esports, and especially the Dota 2 community, of course, enjoy what I'm able to do. So professionalism is all about the attitude more than the voice or anything else. If you have a professional attitude, no matter how you sound or how you look, etc., it will come through. It's the same thing with class, and, you know, we're not going to get into a discussion. It's almost philosophical to talk about how class is a state of mind or whatever, but professionalism is the exact same thing if you buy into that approach, which I happen to do so. If you hold yourself to a very high standard of professionalism, voice and everything else kind of comes afterwards. So be it broadcasting, be it speaking, be it giving a presentation to colleagues, no matter what it is, start first and foremost with who you are and how you view yourself and how you want others to view you or hear you or what the case may be. But if you start with that, eventually, whatever you want to try and shore up or improve upon, be it a broadcasting voice or be it just your ability to communicate with others, that will come in time. So just, again, make sure you start with yourself and work outwards from there. Our next question comes from Alex A via Facebook, and he asks, "Growing up in West Virginia, how did you even get into esports? I'm a West Virginian too, and I had never heard of anything like competitive gaming before a friend of a friend told me a fellow WV guy was doing this work." It really doesn't have anything to do with geographic location, and although I get what you're saying. If you grow up in a number of parts of West Virginia, you're just not going to be exposed to this kind of thing. Like, I remember when I first moved to Morgantown to go to college, to go to WVU, the idea of a LAN center, like, I knew what a LAN center was by that time. I mean, I was 18, I would hope I would. But like a LAN center or comic book shops, those kind of things just didn't exist where I grew up. I grew up in a southern coalfield town named Logan. I'm there right now, actually. But those kind of things, that part of culture just isn't present in a lot of rural areas, not just in the United States, but across the world. So I totally get what you're saying with that. Is esports is not something that's going to occur to most people from our part of the world if you're like me and you grew up in a small town. But so far as competitive gaming and how I got into it, I'll give you the short version. Is I got into a game called Guilty Gear when I was in college, and got really, really into it, as in, like, it was that and alcohol and girls were basically the three things that took up most of my time outside of class. And had a couple of buddies, one named Thavi, who's one of my best friends from way back when, all the way back to preschool, and he had a friend named Kyle. and they were really into it before I was, and they got me into it. So we played it very competitively. We watched tournament VODs of all these amazing Asian players and all that, and we tried to make our own little combo videos and, you know, all that fun stuff. But eventually, I moved to Orlando, Florida. And while I was there, there was a fairly robust, and still is a fairly robust, 2D fighter scene there. And I played in some tournaments there, won some money and all that kind of stuff. So that was my first introduction to esports as a concept. To esports as an industry, I really didn't get into it until Starcraft II. I had been a huge Brood War guy, and I knew what Team Liquid was all the way back from those days, but I was never very into it. It was more of an, I'm aware that there are Asians who play video games professionally, but I don't keep up with it. I was in that mode. But when StarCraft II came out, I decided to check into it more. And like most people, I ran across Day 9. Day 9 was one of my first big inspirations, or access points is probably the better way to put it, to esports in a way that even a novice could understand and get into. And from there, I started to work in esports, and I've done a lot of interviews about that, so I'm not going to recap that. If you want to write in and ask me specifically, maybe I'll answer a question in a future episode. But yeah, that was basically my path to esports. And our third question comes from Tara D via Facebook, and she says, Mr. Chambers, which you can't call me that on, makes me feel so old. Anyway, Mr. Chambers, my boyfriend, keeps trying to get me into Dota, but I'm having a hard time getting started because of the learning curve. He's agreed to play Team Fortress with me 2 nights a week if I play Dota with him on the weekend. He's going to start with Pyro, and I'm going to start with what? What heroes are the best heroes to start out with if you're new? First of all, it's awesome that you've got a boyfriend that games and that you guys can share that hobby. I think gaming, and this is outside, I mean, even if I wasn't working in gaming, I think anyone who observes from the outside will notice that couples who game together do stay together. It's a really, really great hobby to share with a significant other, so kudos to both of you for finding each other. Moving on. Assuming that you're going to want to play with him, I'm going to assume you want to play with him in lane. So, since you're new, how about we put you on a support? Now, I'm going to name 3 heroes that I think are going to be good for you to start with. The first is Venomancer. Venomancer, a little snake guy. He dies pretty easy, but he's got a lot of high value spells. And you can just focus on allowing your boyfriend to kind of take the lead in lane. You can land a good gale, and maybe you'll get a kill, whatever. Then there's Crystal Maiden. And I've noticed, actually, Crystal Maiden is extremely popular with the ladies of Dota in general. I mean, outside of the fact that she's a pretty solid hero. She's not nearly on the level she used to be. She used to be a Tier 1 support. Now she's much more situational. Don't see her nearly as much as we did 2 or 3 months ago. But she still is arguably one of the best, if not the strongest, level 1 through 3 heroes in the game. I mean, she's just so good with Frostbite, with the Nova, and her passive, whatever, you can talk about that. But anyway, she's really good in lane. She's going to allow you to be a big factor in lane, even at the early levels. And the cool thing about Veno and Crystal Maiden both is that they're very straightforward. Their spells have very, very straightforward purposes, and same with their passives and all that fun stuff. And they're going to be good no matter what, even through the mid-game. So if you get behind because you're new and you're not doing that well, you're still going to be able to have an impact on fights and all that. But then there's Jakiro. And I think once you're comfortable playing on Venomancer and Crystal Maiden to kind of get your head around the game and get a nice start into the game, you can start on Jakiro. He's a little bit more complicated, but he has good strength gain, and he's got one of the best spells in the game, all throughout the game. In fact, right now, I was having a conversation with Draskell about this. Guy I cast with very frequently, and those who know me know Draskell without a doubt. And if you don't know Draskell, you need to. He's awesome, so look him up. But anyway, the new Ice Path, the new and improved Ice Path, might be the best spell in the game, just as a general purpose tool. And won't get into a lot of analysis on that. But yeah, so those are the 3 I would recommend for you. And remember, I already kind of made a joke on this, but not only do the couples that game together stay together, the couples that first blood together usually have really good nerd sex afterwards. So get to it and enjoy it. Hopefully he enjoys Team Fortress as much as I'm sure you're going to enjoy Dota. And our next question comes from Tombstone via email. He asks, AC, which has the best Dota teams? China, Europe, or USA? Why? Does get a whole lot more straightforward than that, so thank you for the question and for being succinct, Tombstone. But as is often the case, the simplest questions tend to have the most complicated answers. In terms of just their ability to win and beat other people, I don't think anyone's going to argue that China leads in that category. China has just the best players overall, the best team cohesion, etc. And again, I don't think I'm insulting anyone by saying that, but what I don't think a lot of people consider, and this is an argument that I used to have way back in my Starcraft days as well, and it was concerning Koreans instead of Chinese, just in terms of why do the Koreans just stomp every other region? Why are the Korean players so good? And I think the answer is very similar in the case of China and in Korea. And it's multi-pronged, but the first of which is money. I mean, just to be completely real with you, the fact that in Korea and in China, pro gamer is not only like a legit profession, I mean, it's legit in Europe and USA, but like if you're a professional gamer in China, that's like saying, oh yeah, I play tennis for a living. In other parts of the world where I play golf or what have you. It's not something you see very often in terms of day-to-day life, but it's something everyone knows exists. Like no one's going to bat an eye at that in the more urban parts of China, just like in South Korea. For StarCraft, for example. Europe and the USA are beginning to shift in that direction, but it's just not a big a part of our culture to the point where it's just ingrained yet. But anyway, back to China. The fact that that is an actual occupational choice for the Chinese is a pretty big deal, just in terms of a motivator for practice and for dedicating yourself to a team, for letting petty things go. And we all know, we've all seen it already in the early stages of Dota 2, and especially when you go all the way back to Dota 1. Petty arguments and petty disagreements between teammates are going to cause big rifts sometimes. They're going to break up teams that otherwise would have been really, really good. But whenever you have, whenever it's treated as a legit job, not just as a, oh, this is a cute thing I can do for money, which, and let's be honest, and except for the 0.5% of pro gamers and esports workers, there were people who try to get involved and produce esports content. Except for the tip top of that, for most people it is, at best, supplementary income. And that's, again, at best. For most, it's a labor of passion and a labor of love. But whenever, again, you have teams that are multi-million-dollar investments, which is the case in China in a lot of cases, it's going to create a different mindset. It's going to be much more of a motivation to practice. And that's another big factor that I think needs to be discussed, is just practice. I mean, when you look at, let's take, for example, Dignitas. Love those guys. They are teenagers still yet. Most of them are very young. In fact, Owie, I want to say he's like 16 years old, which is just mind-blowing given how good he is at Dota. But anyway, when you're a 16-year-old kid, or even going on up to 18, 20, 21, whatever, it is really, really hard to balance your priorities and say, you know what, my number one priority, as if it is going to be my long-term career, is to sit at home and play the game I like, the game I love even, but to do it even when you don't feel like doing so, to do it for the sake of pure practice and fun, if fun factors in at all, is supplementary. That's a very hard thing to do at that age. I was actually on an esports talk show called The Panel just recently, and was there with Navi's CEO, and we had a brief conversation, a bit of a back and forth about it, about how hard it is. I mean, to imagine at 20 years old, you have a choice on a Friday night of sitting inside and playing for 10 hours, not to play for fun with your friends, but to spend 10 hours, say from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m., because usually that's kind of the schedule a lot of nerds keep, myself included. But to opt to spend that time not playing for fun, but genuinely practicing, doing things that are not fun to improve your game, as opposed to, say, staying over at your girlfriend's. Like, that's a hard choice to make at 20 years old. And I just think that choice is a lot easier to make in favor of long-term prospects and long-term improvement whenever you come from a culture that is much more supportive and which embraces the occupation a lot more. Not to say that the European and the culture here in the U.S. are in opposition to it. It just is not something you grow up thinking. Usually in Europe and in the USA, 9 times out of 10, in fact in the USA I'd say 999 times out of 1,000, you grow up and just learn about esports a year or two before you really get involved in it. Europe, and again, I'm speaking from what I know from third-party accounts, so if I'm incorrect, please write and let me know, and I'll certainly address it in a future mailbag. But I would say it's pretty close to the same thing in Europe, and in China and in Korea for StarCraft, or excuse me, for Dota and StarCraft respectively. That's not really the case, and I think that has a lot to do with it. That said, I will, just for the sake of smoothing ruffled feathers, if my response has ruffled any feathers, I've already said my pros about China. I think the pros in Europe, I think Europe has a much more united community, and when I say community, I don't just mean people on message forums and all that. I mean, to me, the Dota community in Europe feels much more all-encompassing even than China's. It feels much more cohesive and much more passionate in terms of just pure joy derived from the game and pure enthusiasm. And in the USA, I think, and again, maybe this is maybe this is typical arrogant U.S. thinking, but it seems to me, and I mean this in all, and being genuine, trying to give as honest and objective an evaluation as I can. It seems to me that the people who are involved in Dota from the U.S. tend to be much more, have a lot more personality, if that makes sense. I mean, and it's tough. You can't compare like Dindy. I mean, you know, Puppy, the guys that are just walking, talking in vehicles for entertainment. But just in terms of appealing to a much more broad market, I feel like the United States probably has the best in regards to that. But again, that's just my opinion, so could be right, could be wrong. But to answer your question directly, which was, again, which has the best Dota teams, I think it's China, hands down. And our next question comes from Zachary L. via Facebook. He says, I'm still in high school, but I really want to work in esports eventually. How do esports people make money, and is it really an option for a career? Okay, it's a complicated question, or I should say it's a question with a complicated answer. First of all, is it an option for a career? Yes. Is it an option for a stable career? Not necessarily. And that's something I've talked about in the past before, and that most people will admit to you that work in esports is the big downfall of it is a vast majority of the time, except for the tip-top 1% of people in esports, consistent money, like a consistent paycheck with a 401k and all that, it just doesn't happen. Or if it does, it's super duper rare. So is it an option? Yes. If it's something you're really passionate about, don't rule it out. But going back to how people make money, there are a number of options. The first is streaming, obviously. If you can become a popular streamer, it doesn't matter what you stream. It doesn't have to be the big esports, the quote-unquote the esports. It doesn't have to be League of Legends, Starcraft, or Dota. There are a lot of people who make a lot of money, who make very good money, streaming games that you wouldn't even imagine. I can't remember his name. There's one guy who just streams him playing indie games and answering questions from viewers about the games he's playing, and he'll pull 1,000 or 2,000 viewers at a time, and I wish I could think of who it was. But I'm sure he does well. There are people who play DayZ, the mod for Arma, that make decent enough money. I think the highest I've ever seen in a time is 1,200 people. But 1,200 people, and I'm not going to get into the economics of it. If you really want to research that, there are plenty of resources to do so. But yeah, I mean, you can stream whatever. You can stream you playing vintage games, and I'm sure there's a market for that. I'm sure there's a market for anything you can possibly imagine if you're passionate about it and if you love it. And that's really the key. Esports is an option for a career so long as you go into it knowing it is not something you go to school for, then you get out and you talk to a job placement executive and he lands you a starting entry-level gig in esports. That's not how it works. To get into esports, except in the very, very rare circumstances that somebody happens to know somebody, or take, for example, Anna Prosser's a good example, the fiance, soon-to-be wife of Jeff Robinson in Control, who is a StarCraft II player for EG. I guess you could say she married in esports, or, I mean, situations like that, where she was a very talented young lady anyway, had a passion for gaming that she shared with Jeff, and now she works in esports more or less full-time. Except in cases like that, again, very, very rare, you're going to get your start in esports by working many long hours for free, no pay at all, and doing it because you love it and because you really, really want to try and make a career work. That's how I got started a couple of years ago. My first job in esports was writing articles for $5 an article. Yes, oh, they've been rolling in the money. But, and I only wrote a few, but it opened doors for me in terms of working with its Gosu. And I worked my way up in its Gosu, started casting from there, and now 2 years later, I'm where I am right now, and I'm doing this full time. And I did have a bit of a leg up, again, because of my broadcasting training. But I guess that's probably the biggest piece of advice I would give you, is if you want to work in esports, don't plan on going to school to do it as in, okay, there's a degree in esports, but continue your education and try to be educated in something that lends itself to esports. For example, if you're a graphic artist, great. Go to school so you have your options open to you to do graphics art for other industries, if you need to make a living and what have you. But once you're done with your education, or while you're doing your education, reach out to any organization you can imagine, any esports organization. Don't try, it's unrealistic to go, well, you know what, Team Liquid has a whole lot of hits, or Join Dota has a whole lot of hits every day, so how about I just go work for them? Usually those sites are going to have a pretty in-place staff, and they may take some free work here and there. But don't try to be that guy. Instead, look for an organization where you can make an impact, where you can make a difference, where you can genuinely help an organization who would not be able to do what they can with you there, and work your way up and build a reputation. Connect with all of the people that are a part of the industry you love the most. And that's, I mean, it's the same thing in every walk of life. It's all about networking. Get to know people and be patient. You have to be patient. If you try to rush and just acquire a career in esports, it's not going to work. But it is a viable option for a career. Just make sure you have a backup plan. Realistically, and this depends on where you're from, Zachary. I didn't happen to look after I received your message on Facebook. But based on your name, I'm going to guess Europe or the United States. And again, the money's there to be made, but it is not going to be something that, for example, if you want to get married right out of college, or right out of high school even, or if you want to start having a family in your early 20s, esports probably is not going to be able to do it for you. It doesn't mean you can't still continue to try and break into the industry, but go into it very realistically. And just make sure, again, that your #1 priority is you're doing what you love. Because esports, even when you're getting paid for it, it's still work. And you have to have a passion for what you do. So, is it a viable career? Yes. Is it something you can work towards even now while you're still in high school? Absolutely. How do people make money? Oh, I didn't finish answering that part of your question, so sorry about that. There's streaming. Then there's, again, graphics work, article writing, anything you can name. Basically, any option in journalism as a whole, or in presentation or online web, anything you can name, esports needs it in one way or another. So don't just pigeonhole yourself into being a player or a caster or whatever. There's casting, and, you know, we can go through that. If you want to become a caster, just start casting. It has been my experience that the vast majority of people who say they want to be an esports caster don't actually want to be an esports caster. What they want is to have 500,000 subscribers on YouTube and to have 6,000 people show up for their streams, but they don't actually want to cast. And I don't mean that to be condescending, but it is work. It is very hard work. It's a very stressful occupation. I know, believe me. Still wears on me most of the time. But it is very rewarding. So if you love it, do it. Just make sure you keep your options open and you don't put yourself, especially once you get out of high school and if you go to college, hopefully you do go to college, just make sure that you're continuing to further your skill set, not just in esports, but as a person as a whole, so you can work in other industries while you're pursuing the chance to break into esports in a much more lucrative and stable way. Our next to last question is going to come from Robert Browning E via Twitter. And he says, random question. Why do teams choose a Windrunner so often? 90% of the time I see one played, they lose lane. And here's a not random answer for you. She's pretty good. She's a good hero, Robert. And I'm going to guess when you say 90% of the time that you see one played, she loses lane. I don't know what match you've been watching, so maybe you're right. Maybe 90% of all the matches you've been watching as a whole, the Windrunners have just performed poorly. But usually where you're going to see a Windrunner wind up is going to be in the long lane. And when you have a hero in the long lane, when I say long lane, I guess I should say suicide long lane, as in 1 versus 2 or 1 versus 3 long lane. It's really just, it's not a matter of if you're going to lose your lane, it's when you're going to lose your lane. A Windrunner is not going to be able to hold the line very long against a tri-lane or even a duo lane that's well executed. What makes Windrunner such a strong hero is that she's able to harass, she's able to harass, able to get a lot of experience, able to play very risky because of Windrun, and able to get a lot of things out of a suicide long lane that a lot of heroes can't. She can just play very far forward. She can last hit with power shot even, so she's going to walk away with a little bit of gold. And again, the fact that she can play risky, she can get up in their face, do a little harassment, a little last hitting, and if they engage, she's got an out by using the Windrun. So if that's what you mean, if you're just used to seeing Windrunners not do well, come out a little under-leveled, and not have a lot of gold and lose their tier 1 tower, say, somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes into the game, that's actually pretty standard. Whenever you pick a Windrunner and stick her in the suicide long lane, you know that's going to happen. What's important, though, is she's going to come out better from that situation than a vast majority of heroes could ever possibly have the chance of doing so in that same situation. So you take that and you combine that with the fact that Shackle Shot never stops being a good spell. It's a very versatile spell that you can use for ganking in the late stages of the early game and on into the mid game. It stays viable all the way through to the late game. Power Shot is pretty solid all the way through the mid game. She can exert a lot of map presence just because she is very mobile, especially if you go phase boots on her, which is pretty common, probably the most common item picked up on Windrunner, I would even argue, outside of maybe a mechanism and a force staff. But generally speaking, she's just a very mobile hero. She's good at warding. She plays a very solid support and just good all around. She's not as popular now as she was a few months ago. I mean, there was a time when I can remember the statistics when I first started casting Dota was just absolutely absurd. It was something like she was picked or banned 85% of professional matches. So she's not quite on that level. But in terms of a long lane hero, it doesn't get a lot more stable than a Windrunner. There are heroes who give you a lot more out of that long lane in different ways. For example, Darkseer is now the darling child. I mean, probably picked and banned at that same ratio I said was absurd for Windrunner 6 months ago, which, you know, in that 85% ratio, you just don't see him make it through the first pick ban phase without either being picked or banned. And the reason is he's able to do the same things Windrunner can. He's able to use Surge to get out of trouble. Ion Shell's going to get him some gold, allow him to apply some pressure and harassment. And a well-played Darkseer is just unbelievably hard to handle for a number of reasons. Bounty Hunter is another very popular long lane hero now, and what he gives you out of track and his mobility as well. So Windrunner, again, not quite as popular as she was, but still a very high tier hero. I would even say she's a tier 1.5 hero now. A little bit more situational than she was. She used to be just kind of an all-around sort of a pick if you needed a strong suicide lane. But yeah, if you're seeing her lose 90% of the time whenever she's playing at suicide lane, that's expected. What's important, what you need to pay the most attention to, is what she's able to get done in that time before that tier 1 tower falls. And the last question from this inaugural edition of the Ayesee Mailbag comes from Big Blue 22 via email. He says, Ayesee, I want to learn to cast and stream and all that fun stuff, but I don't know where to start software-wise other than XSplit. What else do you use or recommend? Okay, so here's the reality of the situation. There's a lot of free programs that are going to help you in streaming, allow you to stream, etc., etc., etc. But if you want to do it efficiently, if you want to get a good look, a good product, if you want things that are going to help take some load off of your CPU, for example, get the most out of your hardware, usually you're going to have to spend some money. And, you know, there are two schools of thought on this, I guess you could say. There are some streamers who really just don't care to make do with low-budget stuff, and that's okay. Like, if you can get a good product out of low-budget stuff, low-budget equipment, low-budget software, more power to you, man. I'm not that way. I'm a big subscriber to the idea that you get what you pay for. And it's worth paying for. If you care enough and you really want to turn out a good product, you're usually going to have to invest something up front. So you asked about software. I'm not going to cover hardware, but maybe another time. I'm sure someone will write in and ask about that eventually. It's a common question I get. I just haven't gotten it lately, so it didn't make it into this mailbag. But so far as software, as you mentioned, XSplit now requires an upfront investment, and it's worth it, by the way. XSplit's worth every single penny you're going to have to pay for the license. I can't imagine streaming the way people used to stream, hell, even a year or two ago, before XSplit really came into its own, using proprietary software like Ustream used to require and all that was really just bogged down, way too heavy, functionality was low. So be very thankful for XSplit and definitely invest the money into XSplit. Aside from that, I use DX Story, DXTORY. You can just Google that. And in a nutshell, and I'm not a big tech guy, so if I explain this and it comes out sounding really stupid to someone who actually understands these things, please forgive me. But what it more or less does is turn the video feed from your game, whatever game it might be, into a cam feed that you can then insert into XSplit, as opposed to doing a direct screen capture. Now, the difference between that is I can Alt-Tab out of a game during a broadcast or during a recording, and it continues to record the cam stream, even though my screen might not actually have the game on it anymore. And as you can imagine, that gives a lot of utility in terms of just trying to up the professionalism of your broadcast, to be able to control what goes out if you are streaming and what does not. It gives you a little bit of privacy if you're doing personal streaming and you don't want people to see your instant messages with your girlfriend or what have you. But more than anything, the big benefit is, at least in my case, my experience has been that it heavily increases your performance, the performance of your system, the frame rate you're going to get, and other things like that, as opposed to just doing the built-in functionality of XSplit, which is just capturing whatever is within the little box you draw. So that's definitely worth investing in. Other than that, I don't really use a whole lot of other software. Those are the two main programs I use. Editing and other recording. I mean, there's tons of options. You've got Fraps. You've got Camtasia, for example. I'm actually using Camtasia now to record my voice. And yeah, I mean, just do your research. It's the kind of thing that outside of the two programs that I use the most, and I can heavily recommend, which again are XSplit and DX Story. And I'll tell you what, I'll even throw a link to DX Story down in the description of this video for those who are interested. But other than that, again, it's just your own personal taste, how much you want to invest into it, how dead set you are on YouTube content. If you want to do YouTube content, I highly recommend Camtasia and Vegas. I think those are just amazing programs for what they are and what they do. But your options are pretty limitless, and there are tons of free options as well, so you may just want to Google around and see what others have to say. And we're donezo for this week. I want to thank everyone for joining me for this edition of my mailbag. And if you want to send me some questions, you can find all of my contact information down in the description. You can find me on Twitter, on Facebook. You can email me. And again, in the description for this video, you'll find links to that. I'll go ahead and call them out. My Twitter is @Ayesee, @AYESEE. My Facebook is ACTV. Just do a search for that within Facebook if you're a Facebook kind of person. And you can email me, actv@gmail.com, and possibly be featured on a future edition of the mailbag. But for now, I want to thank you guys for being here. I encourage you to please subscribe. I am trying to build a following here on YouTube, as every YouTuber is. So would certainly be honored to have you as a subscriber, and hope you'll tune in next week. Remember, my schedule is Monday and Wednesdays. I'll be posting repcasts, which are me casting replays of games I didn't originally cast live. You can, and again, catch those on Monday and Wednesday. And on Fridays, I will be doing my weekly mailbag. So for now, take care. See you then.